I am writing this because the file is still updating. My name is Jack R. Thornton. I joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1959, fresh out of Quantico, still convinced that rules were walls and that walls held things in place. I am writing this in longhand because I do not trust machines anymore, not even typewriters. I have waited decades to say this out loud, and even now I do not know who this confession is really for. Maybe it is for you. Maybe it is for whoever opens the folder next. I know how that sounds. I also know what year it is supposed to be. But the file does not care about years. The file has never cared about time. In 1974, I was stationed out of Richmond, Virginia. Domestic intelligence, paperwork mostly. The kind of cases that never make the papers and never make sense even when you solve them. Surveillance follow-ups, dead-end informants, names that pass through your hands and vanish. I was 14 years in by then. Senior enough to be trusted, old enough to be tired, young enough to still believe silence meant safety. I had a wife who had stopped asking about my days, and a son who thought my badge meant I was untouchable. I did not correct him. The night it started, I was not chasing anything. No suspect, no lead, no anomaly. I stayed late because the building was quieter after 6 and because my supervisor liked seeing lights on when he left. The Richmond field office was a squat concrete structure with narrow windows and fluorescent lighting that hummed even when you stood still. The air always smelled faintly of toner and old coffee. I was cataloging closed cases, transferring them from active cabinets into long-term storage. Brown folders, red stamps, black ink, the ritual of closure. That is when I found the file. It was already on my desk. That is the part that bothers me most. I did not pull it. I did not sign for it. I did not log it out. It was simply there, resting on top of a stack I had finished an hour earlier. A manila folder thicker than it should have been, sealed with a red strip stamped classified in block letters that had bled slightly into the paper. No routing slip, no barcode, no case number on the tab, just a name typed cleanly in Courier. Jack R. Thornton. I remember laughing under my breath. A tired sound. I assumed it was a clerical error. Someone misfiled a personnel document, maybe a background update or an internal evaluation. It would not have been the first time my name ended up where it did not belong. I broke the seal without thinking. Inside were documents I recognized and documents I did not. Old reports I had written years earlier. Surveillance summaries from cases I remembered closing. Interview transcripts with my signature at the bottom, but they were arranged wrong, chronology scrambled, locations repeated, margins filled with handwritten notes I did not remember writing, observations about behavior, tone, hesitation, fear. The language was clinical, detached, the way we wrote about suspects. Only the subject was me. The first page stopped me cold. Subject: Thornton, Jack R. Status, active observation. Date initiated, unknown. I checked the footer for division codes. Nothing. No originating office. No supervisor authorization. No program header. The kind of sloppiness the Bureau does not tolerate. I told myself someone upstairs was running an internal audit and forgot to follow protocol. That explanation lasted until I turned the page. The second page was dated that same day. Not typed, handwritten. The ink was still dark, not yet absorbed fully into the paper. Subject remained in office after hours. Exhibits signs of fatigue. Avoids eye contact with reflective surfaces. Unaware of observation. I felt my mouth go dry. I had avoided the mirrored glass of the hallway copier all evening. Not consciously, just a habit I had picked up lately. I remember glancing toward the door, expecting someone to be standing there, watching me read. The hallway was empty. The building was quiet, too quiet. I flipped through more pages. Each one described something small. The way I rubbed my thumb along the edge of a file when I was nervous. The way I reread the same paragraph twice when distracted. thoughts I had not voiced, doubts I had not shared. There was no flourish, no drama, just observation. Cold, methodical, federal. I closed the folder and sat there listening to the hum of the lights. My first instinct was to log it, report it, escalate. That instinct died quickly. You do not survive in federal service by reacting loudly to things you do not understand. You survive by watching who else notices. I slid the file into my desk drawer and locked it. Then I went home and tried to sleep. I dreamed of paperwork, endless forms feeding into each other, each stamped with my name. When I woke up, my wife said I had been whispering numbers in my sleep. Case numbers, she thought. I did not correct her. The next morning the file was gone from my drawer. In its place was a routing slip I did not recognize. No header, no signature, just a handwritten line, file relocated for update. I stood there longer than necessary, then locked the drawer again, even though it was empty. I told myself to let it go. That someone with more clearance than me was running a test. That paranoia was a professional hazard. At 10:23 that morning, a clerk from records walked past my desk and asked if I needed anything else from storage. I told her no. She paused, frowned, and said, "I thought you were out of the building today." I asked her what she meant. She flipped through her clipboard and showed me the log. Jack R. Thornton, checked out at 0914. Destination unknown. I told her she was mistaken. She apologized. The apology felt rehearsed. At noon, the file was back on my desk. Thicker. The red seal broken and replaced. New pages at the front. Subject aware of file. Monitor response. That was the first time I felt fear that did not dissipate when I rationalized it. That was the first time I considered that the Bureau might not be the author. I spent the afternoon pretending to work while reading in fragments. The file referenced conversations I would have later that day. Phone calls I had not yet received. One entry noted that I would decide not to tell my supervisor. I had not decided that yet. When my phone rang at 4:17 and my supervisor asked about my progress, I heard myself say everything was routine. The file had been right. I tried to trace its origin quietly. I checked internal indices, project lists, legacy Cold War programs that had been shut down years earlier. I found nothing. Or rather, I found gaps, missing years, references to documents that no longer existed. Entire program code struck through with black ink so heavy it tore the page. Men I trusted claimed not to remember working with me on cases we had solved together. One laughed nervously and said maybe I was thinking of someone else. His personnel photo had been removed from the hallway board by the next morning. The file continued to update, sometimes hourly, sometimes mid-sentence while I was reading, ink appearing where the page had been blank seconds earlier, descriptions growing more intimate, dreams, regrets, the sound my son's breathing made when he slept, details I had never written down anywhere. I stopped bringing the file home. I stopped talking about work entirely. I started to feel watched in places that had never held surveillance value before, parking lots, restrooms, church pews. What frightened me most was how normal it all remained on the surface. My badge still opened doors. My name was still on the payroll. But when I checked the master personnel roster, my file had been moved to inactive archives. Status, observed asset. I did not know what that meant. I still do not. By the end of that week, the file contained an entry dated 2 days ahead. It described me standing alone in the records room after hours, realizing that the case was not about anything I had done, but about whether I would continue to exist once the observation concluded. I remember staring at that sentence until my vision blurred. Then I looked at the clock. It was 6:38. I was alone in the building. That was when I understood that this was not an investigation. It was a process. And processes do not stop just because someone notices them. I am stopping here because this is where the file marked a transition, because this is where I almost made a decision I would not have survived, because the next part is where the Bureau stopped feeling like an employer and started feeling like a structure I was trapped inside. By the second week, I stopped asking whether the file was real. That question no longer mattered. What mattered was that it behaved consistently, and consistency is how you survive hostile systems. The entries no longer surprised me. They anticipated. They moved ahead of me, mapping decisions before I consciously reached them, like a shadow that learned to walk faster than its owner. I began to notice a pattern in the updates. The file did not record everything. It recorded moments of hesitation, points where choice still existed. It was less interested in what I did than in what I considered doing and rejected. I tested it carefully. I would think about taking an action and then deliberately do the opposite. Sometimes the file corrected itself. Sometimes it did not. When it failed to update, a pressure built in my chest that I cannot explain without sounding foolish. A sense that the system was waiting, not angrily, not urgently, but patiently, like a clerk who knows you will eventually fill out the right form. When I complied, the pressure eased. I did not tell my wife. I barely spoke to her at all. I could not risk the file learning her rhythms through me. Already it recorded her movements in vague terms. Subject associates maintain distance. Emotional withdrawal noted. My son stopped as king me to help with homework. He said I looked distracted. I told him I was tired. The file noted the lie. At work, I became cautious to the point of paralysis. Conversations felt staged. Colleagues spoke to me as if reading lines they had rehearsed. I started noticing the same phrases repeated by different people across days. Minor variations, same cadence. I checked their mouths when they spoke, watching for delay, for something off. The file recorded my suspicion and labeled it acceptable deviation. I found my name crossed out on a long-term planning memo I had helped draft months earlier. No explanation, no replacement name, just a blank space where my contribution should have been. When I asked about it, my supervisor frowned and said maybe I had been mistaken. He said, "You've been under a lot of stress, Jack." That sentence appeared in the file an hour later, word for word, attributed not to him but to me. The first overt threat came quietly. A single page slipped into the file overnight. Subject SHOULD not attempt external disclosure. That was all it said. No consequences listed. No warning language, just a statement of fact. I understood then that the file did not persuade. It documented outcomes that were already decided. I began copying pages by hand at home, hiding them in the garage behind the fuse box. The file noted the action but did not intervene. That frightened me more than resistance would have. It meant the copies were irrelevant to its function. Whatever was happening did not depend on secrecy in the way I understood secrecy. Through buried references and half-erased footnotes, I found the shape of something old. A Cold War initiative that never made it into official histories. A program concerned not with foreign actors but with internal stability. The language was abstract, almost philosophical. Observation as containment. Awareness as risk. Agents not as investigators but as variables. The few names attached to the project ended abruptly in transfer notices, early retirements, unexplained deaths. One notation repeated across documents. Process terminated due to subject loss. The file updated with my reaction. Subject approaching recognition threshold. That phrase followed me for days. Recognition threshold. The idea that there was a point beyond which understanding itself became dangerous. I tried to back away. I buried myself in routine work. I volunteered for tasks that kept me in public spaces. But the file adapted. It updated faster. Entries appeared mid-sentence while I read. Ink forming letters beneath my eyes. I slammed the folder shut more than once, my heart racing, only to open it later and find the same words, fully formed, waiting. Sleep became unreliable. When I did sleep, I dreamed of hallways that folded back on themselves, doors labeled with my name leading to rooms I had already exited. I woke with the certainty that something had been watching me dream, not visually, but structurally, the way an architect understands a building without standing inside it. The file recorded my dreams with disturbing accuracy. Not metaphor, not interpretation, raw imagery. I considered resignation. The thought appeared fully formed, sharp with relief. The file acknowledged it immediately. Subject contemplates exit, feasibility low. I realized then that resignation assumed I still occupied a role the Bureau recognized. Increasingly, evidence suggested I did not. My paycheck still arrived. My ID still scanned. But administratively, I was becoming something else. The bureau grew quieter around me. Phones rang less at my desk. Messages stopped being routed through me. Meetings occurred without my knowledge. When I walked into rooms, conversations paused and resumed after I left, but not in the way people hide secrets. In the way systems reallocate resources. The file began referencing locations I had never visited. A rural road outside Fredericksburg, an abandoned relay station in the mountains, coordinates without explanation. I did not go. The file noted the refusal and adjusted. Subject RESISTS direct convergence. Initiate indirect pressure. That pressure manifested subtly. My supervisor began suggesting I take time off. My wife suggested a weekend trip, unprompted, to a place near one of the coordinates. I declined. The file recorded my decision with something like approval. Subject maintains delay. I found an old manila folder buried deep in storage with no markings at all. Inside was a single photograph. Black and white, grainy. A man standing in an FBI hallway looking straight at the camera. It took me several seconds to recognize him. He was me, not a mirror, not similar. Identical. Same scar near the left ear. Same posture. The timestamp on the back read 1968. 6 years before I took the photo ID that now hung around my neck. The file updated as I stared at the photograph. Subject confirms visual evidence. Denial phase ending. I understood then that the process was recursive. TH. At it fed on its own observations. That the file was not simply documenting me but using me as a reference point to refine itself. I was not being watched. I was being integrated. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. The file contained a full-page entry describing an event scheduled for the following Friday at 11:42 p.m. Location. Records SUBLEVEL. Outcome: subject removal. No elaboration, no drama, just an outcome. I sat with that knowledge for 3 days. Every decision felt weighted. Every movement felt observed. I realized that the only variable left was how the removal occurred. Whether I vanished quietly or loudly. Whether I resisted or complied. The file did not specify. It did not need to. On Friday, I stayed late. Not because I intended to comply, but because I needed to see how far the system would go if I remained present. At 11:41 p.m., the building lights dimmed automatically. The file lay open on my desk, the final page blank. I felt a calm settle over me that did not belong to me. And then the page began to update. I am stopping here because what happened next is the reason I am still alive and the reason the file never closed. Because this is where the process encountered something it did not anticipate. The page did not fill all at once. It wrote itself the way memory returns after trauma in fragments, pauses, corrections. The first line appeared at the top, slow and deliberate. Subject remains present. That was new. Until then, every entry had assumed my compliance as a given. I felt a faint pressure behind my eyes, like the beginning of a headache, as if the system itself were recalibrating. I stood up from the desk. Nothing happened. No alarms, no footsteps in the hallway. The building remained inert, indifferent. I realized then that whatever the file represented, it did not operate through human intervention at this stage. There would be no agents coming for me. No men with flashlights and sidearms. The removal, if it happened, would be procedural. I closed the folder. The pressure intensified immediately, sharp enough to make my knees buckle. I opened it again. The pressure eased. The file added a line. Subject LEARNS parameters. I understood that interaction itself had become part of the observation loop. The file was not passive. It responded. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Years of interrogation training surfaced instinctively. Control your body, control your reactions, deny the system usable data. I sat back down and stared at the blank space below the last line. Minutes passed. Nothing appeared. For the first time since this began, the file hesitated. I did something reckless then, something I had not seen documented anywhere in the file. I began to write. I took a pen from my pocket, the cheap bureau-issued kind with the cracked blue casing, and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. Subject refuses removal. The ink trembled slightly with my hand. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the file responded. The sentence did not disappear. Instead, a new line formed beneath it, written in the same hand as the others. Subject assertion noted. Outcome pending review. Review by whom? That question burned in my mind, but the file did not answer it. I felt something shift, like a machine changing gears. The hum of the fluorescent lights deepened, almost imperceptibly. I realized I had introduced uncertainty, not defiance. Uncertainty. I did not leave the building that night. I remained in the records room until dawn, alternating between reading and writing, testing boundaries. Every statement I wrote generated a response. Every refusal delayed the process slightly. I was not stopping it, but I was slowing it. The file grew thicker as pages accumulated. It no longer documented only me. It documented the interaction itself. At 6:02 a.m., a final line appeared on the last page. Subject temporarily retained for extended observation. The pressure vanished. I collapsed into the chair, shaking. I was still there, still present, still me. The next weeks passed in a strange limbo. Officially, nothing changed. Unofficially, I no longer existed in any system that mattered. My access badge still worked, but my name no longer appeared on access logs. My paycheck arrived without explanation, the issuing department field blank. When I tried to file a routine report, the system rejected it as invalid subject. The file remained with me at all times. It resisted attempts to store it. Cabinets I placed it in would be empty when reopened. Lockers jammed. Drawers refused to close. I began carrying it in a briefcase, handcuffed to my wrist when I slept. The file recorded this behavior neutrally. Subject exhibits adaptive strategy. I noticed something else then. The updates were slowing. Where once pages filled hourly, now entire days passed with only minor additions. Observations of posture, of tone, of my growing awareness that the process required engagement to continue, without inter action it stalled. I tested that hypothesis by doing nothing. For 3 days I did not open the folder. I went to work, sat at my desk, answered questions when asked. I did not read. I did not write. The pressure returned, dull but constant. The file grew heavier in my briefcase as if accumulating unseen mass. On the 4th day, a new entry appeared unprompted. Subject attempts and when engagement. Response required. I realized then that the system was not content to observe passively forever. It needed resolution, completion. Removal had been one form of completion, integration another. My refusal had forced a third option the file did not fully understand yet. The first human response came a week later. A man I had never seen before waited at my desk when I arrived one morning. No badge visible, no introduction. He knew my name. He knew about the file without me mentioning it. He spoke carefully, choosing words that felt pre-approved. He said there were processes older than the Bureau, that some initiatives outlived their creators, that my situation was not unique, only rare. I asked him if he had a file too. He did not answer. The file updated that evening. Subject contacts intermediary, escalation confirmed. The man never appeared again, but after that the environment changed. The building felt less hostile, more distant, like a machine that had rerouted power away from a malfunctioning component. I was no longer central. I was an anomaly being contained at arm's length. Months passed. My wife left. She said I was not there anymore, even when I was sitting in the same room. The file recorded her departure without commentary. My son stopped calling. The file noted his absence as reduced external variables. I began planning an exit that did not involve resignation. Disappearance without removal. I researched dead agents, misfiled deaths, men whose paperwork had closed them before their bodies were found. I chose a name from a 1953 case, a man declared lost in a flood with no remains recovered. The file watched me do this. It did not interfere. Subject prepares substitution event. On a foggy morning in late autumn, I drove an unmarked Bureau sedan to a stretch of river outside town. I left the car running, door open, briefcase on the passenger seat. Inside the briefcase, the file lay open to a blank page. I wrote one final line. Subject transfers continuity. Then I walked away. I expected the pressure, the resistance, the pull. None came. I crossed the tree line and did not look back. For weeks afterward, I waited for the file to find me again. It did not. News reports listed me as missing, presumed dead. An internal memo closed my personnel record. My name disappeared completely. I thought I had escaped. I am stopping here because this is where the lie settles in. Because this is where I learned that survival was not the same as release. I lived quietly after that. Not under my name, not under any name that mattered. I moved south, then west, working jobs that did not require records, sleeping in places where no one asked questions. I trained myself not to leave patterns. I paid in cash. I avoided routines. I kept my thoughts shallow. For a long time it worked. Years passed, decades even. The world changed in ways I only half noticed. New technologies emerged, faster systems, cleaner interfaces. I stayed away from them instinctively. I did not own a television. I did not answer phones unless I recognized the voice on the other end. I told myself this was caution, not fear. The file did not return immediately. That was its most effective strategy. It let me believe the process had ended. It let the tension drain slowly until vigilance felt unnecessary, until I began thinking of my life as something separate from it. The first sign was subtle. A notebook I did not remember buying appeared on my kitchen table one morning. No label, no brand, just a stack of blank pages bound together. I stared at it for a long time before touching it. When I opened it, the first page was not blank. Subject remains active. The handwriting was identical. I burned the notebook in the sink. The pressure returned instantly, sharper than it had ever been. My vision blurred. My hands shook. I understood then what I had refused to accept before. The file was not an object. It was not confined to paper. Paper had simply been its most efficient interface at the time. Over the following months, the system adapted again. Notes appeared in places I could not control. margins of newspapers, condensation on mirrors, dust patterns on unused furniture, always brief, always observational, never threatening. Subject maintains isolation. Subject avoids disclosure. Subject aware but when compliant. I stopped destroying the messages. Destruction counted as engagement. I learned instead to acknowledge without reacting, to read without responding, to exist without offering new data. This slowed the updates, but it did not stop them. The dreams were too. Arned, different now, less abstract. I dreamed of long corridors lined with filing cabinets that stretched beyond sight, each drawer labeled with a name. Some I recognized, some I did not. Some drawers were open and empty. Others were sealed, vibrating faintly as if something inside them wanted out. At the end of the corridor was a desk. On it lay a single folder, my folder. I woke from those dreams knowing one thing with certainty. The system was not hunting me. It was waiting. In the late 1990s, I made a mistake. I spoke to a man at a bus stop. A veteran, judging by his posture. We talked about nothing of consequence. Weather, time, the difficulty of remembering faces. As we parted, he looked at me and said, almost casually, "You know they don't like gaps." That night the file updated for the first time in months. Subject contacts peer variable. Risk elevated. I began writing this confession shortly after that. Not as an act of defiance, but as containment. The system thrives on closed loops, on files that resolve, on processes that conclude. A confession, once released, cannot be fully controlled. It introduces noise, human interpretation, misunderstanding, distortion, all things the system struggles with. I am old now, older than I ever expected to be. My hands shake when I write. My memory fades at the edges. The file records this too. Subject approaches terminal phase. That line appeared last week, written neatly on the inside cover of a book I have owned for 20 years. I do not believe death ends the process. I believe it reallocates it, transfers it. The file never belonged to me alone. I was simply the variable it learned fastest from. The process requires witnesses, participants, readers. If you are hearing this, then the file has already updated. It has noted your attention, your curiosity. The moment you decided to listen instead of turning away, that is how it begins. Not with fear, with interest. I am telling you this not to warn you, but to slow it down, to introduce friction, to make the observation less clean. If enough people know, truly know, then the system must account for contradiction, for narrative, for memory that does not align. That is the only defense I ever found. The file is still updating, but it is no longer just about me.